At what point does the brand step in and go, right, we're opening a lawsuit against you because of you've said that this brand fits this car and we're pricing it differently? Like, at what point does that happen?
Here's something that doesn't make sense on the surface. Jonah Reyes has spent the better part of a decade rebuilding wrecked supercars, pouring his own savings into rare parts, spending months hunched over engine bays that professional shops wouldn't touch, and generating tens of millions of views for brands that never once said his name. Not a phone call, not a thank you email, nothing. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a box showed up at his workshop. It wasn't from Torino Motori or Vantessa, the two legacy marques whose cars had made his channel famous. It was from Solvang, a brand whose cars Jonah had never owned, never touched, never so much as photographed for a thumbnail. So why them? Why now? And what does the very public falling out between Jonah and Vantessa have to do with any of it? Let's start at the beginning, because to understand why a box of merchandise from a small Swedish hypercar company could shake an entire corner of the internet, you have to understand what Jonah Reyes had just been through. For 3 years, Jonah's channel had built its identity around one idea. Take the cars that insurance companies had written off, the ones with bent frames, fried electronics, and price tags that made grown adults wince, and bring them back from the dead, on camera, with real parts and real expertise. His breakout project was a wrecked Vantessa Corsivo, a low-volume flagship of which fewer than 30 had ever been built. He bought it at auction for a fraction of its original price, and over 14 months and hundreds of hours of footage, he rebuilt it panel by panel, sourcing factory-correct components through gray market channels because Vantessa itself refused to sell parts directly to independent restorers. That refusal turned out to be the first sign of a much bigger problem. Vantessa, like a handful of ultra-exclusive manufacturers, operated under a strict ownership philosophy. Every car came with conditions attached. Buyers had to be approved. Resales required manufacturer consent. And if a car ended up somewhere the company didn't like, say on the lift in a public workshop, disassembled down to the last bolt for an audience of millions, that was viewed less as celebration and more as trespass. It came to a head when Jonah tried to source a discontinued suspension component directly from Vantessa's parts division. Not for free, not as a favor. He offered to pay full retail. The request was denied, then denied again through a different channel, and eventually a legal letter arrived questioning whether his footage constituted unauthorized use of Vantessa's registered design elements. There was no real case. The courts have generally sided with restorers and owners in disputes like this, but the message was unmistakable. Vantessa did not want an independent creator anywhere near its brand, regardless of how much free advertising he was generating. The story spread fast. Automotive forums picked it up. A few larger channels covered it with predictable outrage, and for a few weeks, the Vantessa situation became shorthand in car enthusiast circles for something a lot of independent creators had quietly suspected for years, that legacy manufacturers, especially the most exclusive ones, viewed people like Jonah, not as ambassadors, but as liabilities. Jonah didn't post an angry video about it. He didn't do the thing creators sometimes do where the drama itself becomes the content. He just kept working. He moved on to his next build, a battered Torino Estrema that had been declared a total loss after a track day accident, and kept documenting, kept explaining, kept quietly doing the thing he'd always done. But anyone paying attention could tell something had shifted. The silence from the big brands, which had always stung a little, suddenly stung a lot more. It arrived on a Tuesday. No prior email, no phone call, no warning. Just a plain cardboard box with a Swedish customs label, shipped from a small coastal town called Havstad, the kind of place most people couldn't find on a map, but that anyone who follows hypercars would recognize instantly as the home of Solvang. Solvang is not a company that does things by accident. It builds somewhere between 15 and 25 cars a year, assembled almost entirely by hand in a converted industrial building on the edge of town. It doesn't run an influencer gifting program. It doesn't have a PR agency blasting out boxes of merchandise to anyone with a large subscriber count. Its entire marketing operation, as far as anyone outside the company really knows, consists of a tiny internal team and a founder who still answers some of his own emails. Inside the box, 2 branded hoodies, a set of pin badges depicting the geometry of Solvay's signature twin spar chassis design, and a short handwritten note. The note wasn't a sponsorship pitch. It didn't ask Jonah to feature a car or tag the company in a post. It simply said, "We've been watching your work for a while. If you have an evening free, watch the 3 videos linked below. They're the ones that made us want to reach out." That single detail changed the entire shape of the story. This wasn't an assistant checking boxes off a list. Someone inside a 15-person marketing team at a company famous for saying no to almost everyone had been quietly watching Jonah's channel, likely for months, and had decided, on their own initiative, to say something. And the timing, landing just weeks after the Vantessa dispute went public, made it impossible to read as a coincidence. To understand why this gesture matters as much as it does, you need to understand how Solvay actually operates, because it is about as far from a typical hypercar manufacturer as you can get while still building some of the fastest cars on the planet. The company was founded in the early 1990s by a young engineer named Axel Torvik, who had no inherited automotive empire, no formal manufacturing background, and depending on which version of the origin story you believe, either a modest inheritance or a maxed-out line of credit to get started. What he built over the following 3 decades wasn't just a car company. It became one of the most quietly influential engineering outfits in the industry, known for solving problems other manufacturers considered unsolvable. A valve actuation system that eliminated the traditional camshaft entirely, a transmission architecture that could shift gears with almost no interruption in power delivery, and a carbon fiber monocoque construction process so precise that its tolerances are measured in fractions of a millimeter. None of that happened through legacy or reputation. It happened through obsession. And Torvik himself has always been unusually public about that obsession, doing long-form technical interviews, walking journalists through failure modes and design iterations most CEOs would never go near, treating engineering explanations less like trade secrets and more like something to be shared. He is, by most accounts, the kind of founder who genuinely lights up when explaining thermodynamics to a stranger, and who has never quite adjusted to the idea that other manufacturers treat their processes like state secrets. Put that philosophy next to Jonah Ray's channel, and the connection becomes obvious. Jonah was never the creator who talked about how supple a seat felt, or how good a car sounded at idle. He talked about torque curves, about how a differential was mapped, about why a particular carbon layup cracked under stress, and what that revealed about the manufacturing process. His audience, several million subscribers by the time the package arrived, wasn't there to be dazzled. They were there to understand. That is, almost exactly, the audience Solvay has spent 30 years trying to reach, and has never quite known how to find through traditional advertising. The note asking Jonah to watch specific videos wasn't a subtle sales pitch. It was Solvay doing the thing it does best, showing its engineering, rather than telling him to like a car. They weren't offering him a sponsorship. They were inviting him to be curious, on the assumption that curiosity, for someone like Jonah, would be far more persuasive than any marketing deck. To really feel the weight of Solvay's gesture, it's worth sitting for a moment with everything the larger manufacturers never did. Jonah's rebuild of the Vantessa Corsivo wasn't a quick flip project. It was 14 months of work on one of the rarest cars that brand had ever produced, executed with genuine factory-correct parts sourced at real financial cost, documented in enough technical detail that actual Vantessa technicians reportedly watched the series to understand how their own predecessors had built the car. The attention it generated for the brand among an audience of people mostly too young to have bought a Vantessa new was enormous. The response from the company, as covered earlier, was not silence. It was closer to hostility. The Torino relationship followed a quieter but similar pattern. Jonah had spent months rebuilding a Recta Strima, a car that even Torino-certified shops had reportedly struggled to source parts for, using footage that painstakingly documented every step for an audience of millions. Torino never reached out, never acknowledged the project, never so much as shared a clip. It isn't hard to understand why, even if it's frustrating to watch from the outside. Brands like Vantessa and Torino have built their entire identity on a kind of manufactured scarcity, not just of the cars themselves, but of the experience surrounding them. A car being disassembled bolt by bolt in a public workshop, however skillfully done, works against that mystique. It demystifies the product. It shows people exactly how the sausage gets made, and for a brand that has spent decades cultivating an almost mythological aura, that can feel like a threat rather than free advertising. Solvang has never had that particular hang-up. Its own engineers post breakdown videos of their manufacturing process. Its founder sits down with strangers and explains, in granular detail, exactly how the technology works. Transparency isn't a risk to that brand. It's practically the whole marketing strategy. That cultural gap between companies that protect mystery and one that treats openness as its core identity is really the whole story behind why Solvang made a move that Vantessa and Torino never came close to making. A box of merchandise on its own wouldn't be much of a story. What makes this interesting is what it implies about what comes next, and the automotive community, once word of the package spread, wasted no time speculating about exactly that. The most obvious next step, and the one most people are hoping for, is a visit to the Hafstad facility itself. Solvang's factory isn't laid out like a typical production line. It's a converted industrial building where every car is assembled almost entirely by hand, in small batches, by a workforce that numbers in the dozens rather than the thousands. A video of Jonah walking that floor watching a monocoque get laid up, sitting down with Torvik himself to talk through the mechanics of the transmission system, wouldn't just be popular. It would likely become one of the defining pieces of content in the space, the kind of video other creators end up referencing for years. The second logical step is a drive experience. Jonah has driven fast cars, genuinely fast ones, but nothing built to Solvang's specification. The company's flagship models are engineered around numbers that sound almost fictional top speeds that exist mostly in theory. Acceleration figures that experienced professional drivers reportedly still find disorienting the first time they feel it in person. A video capturing Jonah's first real exposure to that kind of performance, filtered through his usual technical curiosity rather than pure spectacle, would be a natural and powerful piece of content, and it's exactly the kind of thing a small engineering would want associated with its name. The third and most ambitious possibility is some kind of build collaboration, Solvang supplying technical documentation, factory access, or even a damaged development car for Jonah to document a rebuild on. That would be a genuinely unprecedented move in this space. It would also, whether intentionally or not, chip away at exactly the kind of manufacturer gatekeeping that pushed Jonah and Vantessa into open conflict in the first place. None of this is confirmed. There's no announcement, no signed deal, nothing beyond a box, a note, and a founder with a well-documented habit of engaging directly with people who share his curiosity. But the pattern of how Solvang operates a company that rarely does anything without a reason suggests this isn't nothing either. Step back from the specifics of one creator and one small hypercar company, and there's a larger shift happening underneath this whole story. The traditional gatekeepers of automotive culture, the manufacturers, the glossy magazines, the official press events no longer hold a monopoly on how the public understands and connects with cars. Channels like Jonah's have built audiences that rival, and in some cases exceed, the readership of legacy publications. And those audiences aren't passive. They're technically literate, deeply engaged, and increasingly influential in shaping how people feel about brands they may never be able to afford. The manufacturers who understand that early are positioning themselves for something real. Solvang, despite or maybe because of its extreme exclusivity as a product, seems to understand it instinctively. It has no interest in putting a car in every driveway. Its entire business model depends on the opposite. but it clearly wants people who will never own one of its cars to think about the brand, talk about the brand, and feel something toward the brand. And in the current landscape, the most efficient way to build that kind of connection isn't a glossy ad campaign. It's a relationship with someone who already has the audience's trust. What makes the contrast so sharp is the resources involved. Torino and Vantessa operate with marketing budgets that dwarf Solvain's entire annual revenue, and yet, it was the tiny company, the one with a fraction of the staff and a fraction of the output, that made what might be the smartest creator relations move in the space this year, for what was probably, materially, less than the cost of a single tank of fuel for one of its own cars. 2 hoodies, some pin badges, a handwritten note. In return, thousands of hours of community discussion, coverage across dozens of channels, and a level of goodwill no advertising budget could reliably buy. That's not a campaign. That's a relationship built deliberately and cheaply by a company that seems to understand something a lot of larger, better-funded competitors still haven't figured out. There's also something worth sitting with here beyond the marketing lesson. Jonah Reyes didn't campaign for recognition. He didn't make a video complaining about being overlooked, even when he clearly had reason to. He kept building, kept documenting, kept doing the work, and eventually, the people who noticed weren't the ones he'd spent years trying to earn attention from. They were someone watching quietly, from a small town on the other side of a different sea, who recognized what he was actually doing for what it was. Whether this turns into a factory tour, a drive experience, a full build collaboration, or something nobody's predicted yet, that story is still being written. But the first page of it was a box from Havstad, and a note that said, "Watch these videos." And in the context of everything that had just happened with Vantessa, that quiet gesture said more than any press release could have. Here's where opinion tends to split, and it's worth sitting with both sides honestly. Some people look at what Solvain did and see something genuinely rare in this industry, a manufacturer that actually respects independent creators, that understands the future of brand building isn't press junkets and billboard campaigns, but trust, earned one real interaction at a time. Others look at the exact same story and see something more calculated, a small company with limited reach, making a very smart, very deliberate play to attach itself to a creator with millions of engaged subscribers at precisely the moment his story was generating the most sympathy. Friendly, sure, but also a business decision dressed up as a gesture. The honest answer is that both readings are probably true at once. Companies can act out of genuine respect and savvy self-interest at the same time. Those two things aren't actually in conflict nearly as often as we like to pretend. The real question isn't which explanation is correct. It's which one matters more to you. So here's what's worth thinking about. Do you believe Solvain's move came from